Ma'am, did you not know that we were filming a video here? We're trying to figure out how much it costs to produce the eggs which you make. Back for part 2 of the video, and here's what we produced over the course of those 15 eggs. Lots of eggs, buckets and buckets of eggs, red buckets and pink buckets of eggs. Over the course of those 15 days, we produced a total of 113 eggs, using 40 pounds of feed. Well, actually, let's do this math on some paper. I'll be right back. I think it's going to be better to do this one on paper. Over the course of 15 days, what started out as 15 chickens, actually had one die the day before, was actually 14 chickens, consumed a total of 40 pounds of organic pelletized feed. Over the course of those 15 days, consuming the 40 pounds of feed, they produced a total of 113 eggs, or 9.4 dozen. So if we start doing the math here, as a reminder, organic feed itself costs me $24.99 for 40 pounds. There's no tax on that since the feed is used to produce food. If we take that down to a per pound basis, I pay $62.50 per pound for the feed itself. Now let's figure out how much do these 9.4 dozen eggs cost. Let's start with just the feed cost involved. So what is $24.99 divided by 9.4? For that, we get a total of $2.65. That's my homegrown cost of eggs right there. Or is it? Well, beyond the feed, there's a couple of other additional costs that go into it. We have some bedding, we have some calcium, we have some grit, and if I count the carton itself, that's wrapped into it. The bedding itself, 1 cube of bedding that I get from Supplier Tractor Company costs about $5.99. That's going to last me a month, so it's going to cost me about $1.50 per week. So if I allocate this out over to the 15 days, let's call it $3 went into the total to produce this 9.4 dozen eggs. That $3 divided by 9.4 gives us a total of 30 cents. So that takes our eggs from $2.65 now, plus 30. Now we're up at $2.95 per dozen eggs. The calcium itself is pretty cheap. It's about $8 for 50 pounds. Let's call that a non-factor. There's pennies there. Grit, same thing, pennies involved. The carton itself, depending on how many you're buying, well, they're not that expensive, and you can get them down to, we'll be conservative and call it 25 cents. So if I was going to cartonize these and sell them, that adds another 25 cents to my cost, bringing me up to $3.20 on my cost of eggs. Now, since these are homegrown, I really don't need to count that. So for me as a consumer, that's what I'm paying, $2.95. What's not factored in here, and this is the thing a lot of people don't factor in, especially farmers, is this thing, the labor. What was my labor to produce these eggs? Well, on a day-to-day basis, not very much. I'm spending only a few minutes each day just to open the coop, to shut the coop, to get the eggs, to put bedding in, to put feed in. I might have, on a normal week, 1 hour per week into it. So if I'm going to pay myself a wage of $20 per hour, and I spend 1 hour per week, we're 15 days, so now we're up to $40 per 2 weeks. The labor over the course of those 2 weeks is $40 for 2 weeks. If we take this $40 and apply it over 9.4 dozen, this is where the math starts to get scary, because the per dozen cost of labor is actually $4.25 per dozen. That takes my now $2.95 or 320 eggs and brings them up to $7.45 per dozen with labor involved. That's crazy. This is why eggs aren't that profitable for a lot of people. Now, I get this is a hobby level, this is a homestead level, and 1 hour might be overly time committed, might be too much. And the $20 an hour, people can argue about that, but how cheap do you actually want to value your time? I mean, $20 an hour is a decent wage. If you're valuing your time much less than that, it's probably not realistic because your time is worth more than $5 an hour or $0 an hour, like a lot of people factor into this. It's actually pretty shocking when you look at this math, how much of the labor component it is. Now, the labor component itself is actually worth more than the eggs themselves, the input costs. Now, what I want to compare this to is some eggs sold at a conventional retailer. I just happened to see a flyer the other day for a grocery retailer near me that had a name that looked something like this. They actually had eggs at this store right here for 53 cents per dozen. That's insane. I don't even know how they're producing them for 53 cents per dozen. If we think about the feed that went into it, so in my case, 40 pounds of feed produced a total of 113 eggs. That means each individual egg represents 0.35 pounds of feed per egg. So in 1 dozen eggs, we have a total of 4.20 pounds of feed. In my math, for what I pay, if we multiply this by 62.50, we get just where I was at, $2.63 per dozen. At 53 cents, let's see how that's even possible. What are they even paying for the feed itself, knowing that there's other input costs in there? Well, 53 divided by 420 is 12.6 cents per pound of feed. So when you buy your eggs at Aldi, you're actually buying eggs that were produced using feed that only cost 12.6 cents per pound. That's ridiculously cheap, considering, again, there's nothing in here. We're not factoring in all the other input costs. Transport, container, markup, infrastructure, medication, insurance, G&A. There are a ton of other costs that go into these eggs, so this is actually, when they're buying it in bulk, probably less than 0.10 cents a pound. And oh, don't forget, we also forgot labor. That's not in there. This is crazy. So when I go to a store like Aldi and I see 53 cents a dozen eggs, and I compare it to Diego's homegrown eggs, which actually cost me $3.20 per pound, it's pretty shocking when you do look at the numbers. Now, one thing that's not accounted for in here is the food that I do give them in terms of this. That's right, I did forget to include this. This is food scraps. I can't not count this in the overall scheme of things because they are getting a bunch of calories from these food scraps themselves. Now, I may dump a bucket this size. Hello. So a few times a week, I'll be giving them some dumps of Glumpity Glump so they can fill up their bellies. But this is one thing that I consider zero cost, yet it is adding to their total calorie intake. So food scraps, some forage, cover crop, and bird seed. These are all unaccounted for food sources that my chickens consume. Food scraps are essentially free because we've paid for them. We've consumed the food, and I'll assume that we're consuming 100% of the dollar value of that food. So everything going to the food scraps is free and clear. It's zero. And it's more or less consistent throughout the year. The forage itself, that's just what they find in the ground. That's free. I'm not paying for any grubs or worms or bugs or seeds that just blow in. That's there. The cover crop itself, this is a cost, but a lot of my beds cost about $1 or $2 at the most to seed out for a cover crop bed. So I might add $1 or $2 over the course of 15 days. We might have $1 to $2 in cover crop seeds. Another thing that's just going to add a little bit more money onto the total cost. And I also have a bird feeder out there, and my kids periodically feed bird seed to the chickens because it's fun. So there's a minimal cost there as well. But these things are contributing to the chickens themselves. Now, one other thing we have to consider here is don't forget this other big one that makes eggs so challenging to make money. Is this seasonality. Because really, my chickens lay at the rate that they're laying at from about February 1 through November 1. So between November 1 and February 1, that's all November, all December, all January, for 3 months, I'm getting less than 1 dozen per week. Not very much at all. And over the course of that dozen per week, I'm still putting the same amount of feed into them, maybe even more. I'm not tracking it that close, but given that it's winter, they're fattening up, they're molting, they may be consuming more feed. It's colder, so 40 pounds are still going into these same chickens to produce a dozen eggs per week. Now the 40 pounds is gonna last 2 weeks, so over that season, my $24.99 over the course of the winter will give me 2 dozen eggs. The cost of those 2 dozen eggs, a whopping $12.50 per dozen, only in feed itself. So this is another reason why eggs aren't as profitable as some people might think they might be, especially for farm-based enterprises. If we're talking homesteading, this is all different. This is a hobby, that type of thing. But for a business, this area is what will kill you. This is why a lot of people just only have chickens through their second molt, and then they'll just butcher the chickens and get rid of them, because there's really no sense in paying to feed them over the winter if you're not getting production. Now you can do all sorts of things like, take your shiny light and put light down on them. But, is that really natural? It probably isn't. That's not something I feel comfortable doing, is forcing the chickens to lay when they're seasonal. That's their time for rest. That's just when they're not laying. I don't really want to change things around through artificial inputs. So if we sum this all up, what are we looking at here? Stores like Aldi that sell eggs at 53 cents a dozen, that's just not realistic. They're not making money. Somebody's not making money, or if they are making money, they're making pennies per dozen to sell these. So let's forget that. That's just the industrial food system gone wrong. That makes no sense in terms of reality or math. But on a homestead level, me feeding organic is $3.20. That includes no labor costs in there, and that also includes no infrastructure like the coop, which I had to go out and build them, and all the runs and the fences that I had to build them. Those aren't factored in. So if you factor those in, they're going to be amortized over a whole bunch of dozen eggs over the lifetime that the chickens use it. Not very much, but there's probably some pennies in there dedicated to that and the time that it took to build all this. And that's actually probably where the money actually goes up a lot, is not really in the materials here, but it's in all the hours of labor that it took to put in these runs and all this fencing. That costs money. If we step back and throw finances out and we say, well, who cares how much they cost? There's obviously a lot of benefits to the chickens that I'm getting in addition to eggs. One is my kids like the eggs. Another is I get the biological pest control, biological disturbance, I get the manure, those types of things, and I know I have transparency. I know what my chickens are eating, I know what they're doing every day, I know what they're given, I know how much space they have, and that makes me feel good, and that's worth paying more. Now, if I was going to buy these same type of eggs at the store near me, a pastured egg down here in Southern California could run as high as $9, which really might sound like a lot per dozen eggs, but if you remember, if we start adding labor in here, my labor is about $7.50 plus the input costs, so they're only making $1.50 per dozen eggs. If you start to really look at this math, eggs should be more like $15 per dozen based upon the protein and fat content of those eggs, which should be actually another good video relative to something like grass-fed beef. eggs themselves, not as profitable as you'd think, not as cheap as you would think, and much more input related than you might think. Now, one thing I totally realized that maybe some people have things like compost and they free range or total free range, call them wild chickens. I get that. For some people who have a lot of land, who have the right context, if you can feed them things like this and basically take grain out of the picture and take labor out of the picture, well then your costs go way down through the floor in that hole down to the sewers. There's nothing there really in terms of input costs if you have that system. But for somebody in suburbia or somebody who doesn't have a lot of land, you're either going to need grain, you're going to need a lot of labor, or you're going to need a lot of inputs to supply the compost or to grow the grain or the crops to feed the chickens, or you're going to have to spend a lot of time foraging for things like juice, scraps, and taking urban waste streams and feeding them to your chickens. So they're not going to be free. You're going to pay for them somehow, either in terms of time, labor, or inputs. In a suburban context, it's obviously different for everybody. But when I look at it and I do the math for me to feel good about the chickens that I'm raising and the eggs that I'm eating, I have to pay $3.20 per dozen donating my labor. Which at the end of the day, I don't mind because my chickens are really pets that produce food. And that makes me and my kids happy. So I'm not complaining. So at the end of the day, these little guys aren't as cheap as you might have thought they might be. $3.20 a dozen is what I'm paying feeding them organic feed. One component of labor that I actually forgot to mention in that little math lesson was the labor that goes into cleaning all these eggs. It's very time consuming actually to clean them all up. Now at an industrial scale they have washers to do this type of thing and things to put them into containers for them. But on a small scale for a farmer, you're either going to be using sandpaper on these or you're going to be washing them, and that's a big component of your labor that you're probably not paying yourself much for, and labor that if you do pay yourself a living wage or an appropriate wage or realistic wage for, it actually makes these guys not as profitable as you would think for a business. At least that's my opinion. Maybe there's somebody out there proving me wrong, but a lot of farmers that I know, people like John Siskovich and others, have tried eggs and they're just not that profitable. And overall, the American public just isn't into paying plus $10 a dozen eggs when they can go to Aldi and pay just 53 cents a dozen. It's kind of pathetic. But for my little girls and for me, we love the 14 chickens we have and we're happy to pay $3.20 for them to produce a dozen, plus all the other auxiliary forms of capital that they bring us. Entertainment, fun, biological disturbance, friendship, because they're really just pets that produce food. Thanks for watching. Until next time, be nice, be thankful, and do the work. Now I may dump a bucket this size a few times a week, maybe say 3 times a week, and it's going to have various things like bread scraps, apple cores, various other things, and all the chickens are getting out of me. And that one's not going to be fun to get. Here. Alright, I got her. Easier than I thought. Ma'am, did you not know that we were filming a video here? We're trying to figure out how much it costs to produce the eggs which you make.